The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like insects trapped in glass, and Ashley Cooper's hands moved through the routine with the precision of someone who had done this 10,000 times before. 8 months at Cedar Creek Medical in Portland, and she had perfected the art of being invisible. The emergency department churned around her, nurses calling for labs, doctors barking orders, the steady percussion of monitors and ventilators, but Ashley existed in the spaces between the noise, where competence went unnoticed and ambition had no currency. She checked the 4-line on room 7, adjusted the flow rate without being asked, caught a dropped medication vial before it hit the tile floor. Small things. Invisible things. The way she preferred it. The antiseptic smell had stopped registering weeks ago, replaced now only by the metallic undertone of blood and the bitter coffee stench that never quite left the break room. Her scrubs hung loose on a frame built for different work, different years. The surgical mask she wore between patients hid the lower half of her face, which meant no one noticed the microscopic tension that sometimes gathered at her jaw. Her hands, though. Her hands were harder to hide. Calloused palms. Scars in patterns that didn't match the standard nursing injuries, one long white line that bisected her left palm, another that curved around her wrist like a signature. The kind of damage that came from holding things together when everything was falling apart. She kept her trauma shears in her left scrub pocket, the metal worn silver from use. An older model, engraved along the flat edge with letters so faded they were barely visible, S6. Just initials, she told herself when anyone asked. Just something from her last job. The shears had saved her more times than most people saved anything, and she carried them the way other women carried photographs. Dr. Marcus Whitfield didn't notice Ashley at all during his morning rounds, which was precisely how she had engineered it. He moved through Cedar Creek Medical like a man who had memorized every hallway and believed he had built them himself, his white coat unbuttoned in a way that suggested both confidence and disdain for protocol. 43 years old, married to a hospital board member's daughter, 5 years into his tenure as chief of surgery, and currently angling for the director position with the kind of hunger that made other people smaller just by standing near him. His residents trailed behind him like remoras, recording his observations on iPads, nodding at angles designed to convey both intelligence and absolute deference. The emergency department hierarchy was rigid and weaponized, exactly as Whitfield preferred it. Surgeons at the apex, radiologists close behind, then the attending physicians, then the residents, and somewhere down in the basement where the fluorescent lights buzzed the loudest, the nurses. Necessary infrastructure. Interchangeable parts. Whitfield had made a career of knowing exactly where everyone stood in that structure and ensuring they never forgot it. Ashley moved through her shift work with the kind of efficiency that made her dangerous without anyone realizing it. When a trauma alert came through at 9:14 in the morning, a single vehicle rollover on Highway 26, she was already prepping the trauma bay before the announcement finished echoing through the hospital intercom. Trauma shears positioned. Gore squared. Equipment cart at 30 inches from the stretcher edge, the distance she had learned in a place where hesitation meant someone's daughter wouldn't come home. The other nurses moved faster when she was working. Unconsciously, like they were sinking to a rhythm they couldn't quite hear. The ambulance arrived with sirens that cut through the morning like razors. Medics wheeling a stretcher, calling vitals, and then the patient appeared, a grizzled man with a kind of weathered face that suggested he had lived 40 years that had aged him 60. Ron Castelliano, according to the intake sheet. 62 years old. Vehicle T-boned at an intersection. Left anterior chest wound. Tension pneumothorax developing. The sucking sound of air through the wound was audible even before they had him fully through the trauma doors, a wet whistle that meant his lung was collapsing on itself. Ashley didn't wait for orders. She had the left arm positioned correctly in seconds, palpating for the landmarks, the second rib, the midclavicular line, her fingers finding anatomy like a musician finding strings. The 14-gauge needle was in her hand and the angiocath threaded through the chest wall with a single smooth motion, and the moment the plunger depressed, the pressure released with an audible hiss of air escaping. The room smelled suddenly of sweat and something sharper, something that tasted like copper at the back of the throat. Whitfield was there by then, having been paged from upstairs, watching the procedure with the clinical detachment he practiced. His eyes narrowed slightly at the precision of Ashley's work, the lack of hesitation, the placement that was flawless. She was still positioned at the head of the stretcher when Ron Castellano's breathing steadied, when the oxygen saturation began to climb, 75, 82, 88, when his eyes cleared enough to focus. That was when he reached for her wrist. His hand was rough and stronger than expected, and when he pulled her down closer, his voice came out as a rasp, each word separated by effort. "I know that hand position. That specific angle. You ran trauma in Fallujah, didn't you?" "I was there. Jolin District." His eyes locked onto hers with a clarity that meant he had recognized something most people spent 8 months missing entirely. "2nd Battalion, 5th Marines." "I was there." Ashley's expression didn't change. Her hands remained steady. She adjusted the fall line and stepped back with a kind of neutral composure that had become so practiced it felt like breathing. "Just making sure your pressure stays stable, Mr. Castellano," she said quietly, and her voice was carefully deferential, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who understood hierarchy and respected it. "You're in good hands. Let's get you upstairs." But her jaw had tightened. Imperceptibly. Just enough. Whitfield was still watching her as she moved away to chart the procedure, his expression unreadable, processing something in the architecture of her movements that had briefly emerged before she pulled it back under control. He had noticed her hand position too, she realized. He had noticed the precision, the muscle memory, the competence that didn't belong to a floor nurse with 8 months of employment history. The silence in the trauma bay lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the monitors resumed their steady beeping, and the ordinary noise of the emergency department rushed back in like water filling a space. The monitors resumed their steady beeping, and the ordinary noise of the emergency department rushed back in like water filling a space. Ashley's hands were already moving toward the supply cart before the patient's eyes closed, her fingers finding the trauma shears without looking, cutting away the blood-soaked bandage with the efficiency of someone who had done this 10,000 times in a place most people only saw in documentaries. The attending physician stood frozen near the doorway, still holding the clipboard he'd been reading when the patient coded. He watched her work and said nothing. Dr. Marcus Whitfield arrived at Cedar Creek Medical at 6:27 a.m., 43 minutes before grand rounds, carrying a leather portfolio and the particular kind of confidence that came from having attended the same prep school as the hospital board president's son. He was 34, with the kind of jawline that suggested generations of trust funds and the kind of voice that made interns apologize for breathing too loudly. His shoes cost more than Ashley's monthly rent. He had been chief of surgery for 19 months, and in that time he had systematically reorganized every protocol, every hierarchy, every tradition that stood between him and the director's office on the 4th floor. The first time he noticed Ashley Cooper, she was moving through the ICU at 2:13 a.m. with the kind of purposeful silence that made her nearly invisible. The second time he noticed her, she was stabilizing a crashing post-op patient while he was still in the surgeon's lounge, eating sushi and discussing his candidacy with the board member who handled his mentorship. The third time he noticed her, it made him angry. Grand rounds began at 7:22 a.m. in the teaching amphitheater, a tiered semicircle of seats where 37 medical students, residents, nurses, and staff gathered to review complicated cases. Ashley sat in the third row, 2 seats from the aisle, her posture perfect, her expression neutral as polished marble. She had done this in Fallujah. She had done this in detention facilities where the questions came faster than bullets. She knew how to disappear even while sitting in plain sight. "This case presents an interesting example of scope creep," Whitfield said, his voice carrying the kind of theatrical projection that suggested he was performing for someone who mattered more than the people in the room. He held up a chart, Ashley's chart, turning it toward the audience like a prosecutor presenting evidence of guilt. A nurse, and I use that term with the specific professional distinction it implies, made an unauthorized intervention on a post-operative hemorrhage without paging the surgical team. "Without paging me?" He paused. The silence hung there like surgical tension. Intervention that was, technically, life-saving. But also technically, a violation of the hierarchical structure that exists for patient safety. Nurses follow protocols. Protocols exist for a reason. His eyes found Ashley across the rows of seated staff. When someone decides they know better than the system, when someone decides their judgment supersedes institutional authority, the result is often chaos masquerading as heroism. Ashley did not flinch. She did not look away. She continued charting on the tablet in her lap, her stylus moving with the kind of steady precision that suggested his words had landed on her like rain on glass. They touched the surface and ran off entirely. Whitfield watched her fail to react. His jaw tightened. He had been expecting something, a flush creeping up her neck, a tremor in her hands, a glance toward colleagues seeking validation that she had done nothing wrong. Instead, he received nothing. She was a void. She was a professional nurse who had made a questionable call, and she was accepting the critique with a kind of equanimity that made his chest feel suddenly compressed. "I'll be implementing a new authorization protocol," he continued, louder now, sharper. "No nursing interventions beyond standard vital stabilization without explicit paging of the surgical resident on call. Any violations will be documented and referred to administration. That is all." The amphitheater released its breath. The residents scribbled notes. The medical students exchanged glances that suggested they had just witnessed something important, though they weren't certain whether it was medicine or theater. Ashley stood, gathered her tablet, and walked toward the exit with the same invisible efficiency with which she had entered. An hour later, she was standing in front of the vending machine on the third floor when Whitfield found her. She had inserted $3 in quarters and was staring at the row of protein bars with the kind of focus someone reserves for surgical targets. He positioned himself to her left, crowding her space by 6 inches, just enough to be felt but not enough to be confronted. "You know what I like about your work," he said. His voice had lost the theatrical quality. It was lower now, more venomous. "You're so quiet. So invisible. That's very valuable in a nurse. It means you don't question. You don't make waves. You don't suddenly decide you're a surgeon." He smiled. It looked like a threat. "That's why I recommended security escorts for non-compliant staff. You understand, purely administrative. Some people need reminders about their role. Some people need to know that when they step outside the lines, there are consequences." Ashley pressed the button for a protein bar. The machine clicked and dropped it into the bin with a sound like a gunshot in the small hallway. "You've been here 8 months, Whitfield continued. Your references are interesting. They don't say much. Previous employment at hospitals I've never heard of. Almost like you don't want people knowing where you've actually worked." He stepped closer. "But you know what I've been thinking? I should know your background better. For credentialing purposes. Peer safety, and all that." She reached down, retrieved the protein bar, and turned to walk away. "You're just a nurse, Ms. Cooper," he said to her back. For words with the weight of a verdict. "Don't forget that." She did not pause. She did not turn. She walked down the hallway with the same measured pace she had walked through Fallujah, the same pace she had maintained through 18 months of Afghanistan, through the kind of situations that transformed other people into new stories. Her face remained a professional mask, her breathing steady, her hands not trembling. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came later that evening when Ashley was alone in the supply closet on the second floor, the one with the narrow shelves of 4 bags and pressure wraps and all the mechanical necessities of keeping people alive. She pressed her forehead against the cool metal shelving, her eyes closed, and she breathed slowly through her nose. In for 4 counts. Hold for 4. Out for 6. A technique taught by people who understood that composure was not the absence of feeling, it was the presence of discipline. Her Navy Cross was sitting in a shadow box in her basement. Her 2 silver stars were framed above it. Her 12-year service record was classified in a file cabinet at Naval Headquarters. And here she was, being told she was just a nurse by a man whose surgical credentials probably looked impressive on paper but whose actual hands had saved fewer lives than she had in her first month of special operations. She pressed her forehead harder against the metal. The cold bit into her skin. She thought about the patient they had stabilized this morning, the one whose post-operative hemorrhage would have become a death sentence if she had waited for Whitfield to finish his sushi. She thought about the mission briefing that had brought her to Cedar Creek Medical in the first place, the patient on the 6th floor with the intelligence connections, the one the Navy had placed her here to monitor because he was moving classified surgical supplies through a black market network and no one could figure out how or why. She thought about how being visible now meant the mission failed. 2 days passed. Ashley worked her shifts with the kind of mechanical precision that turned her into something less than human and more than professional. She charted vitals for patients whose names she would forget in a week. She answered call lights for families who saw only a uniform. She took the security escort jokes that the junior residents began making in her presence, small comments about high-security nursing and administrative supervision, comments that Whitfield had clearly distributed like a memo. She did not react. On the second morning, a construction worker came in with a crush injury to his left leg that had begun the early stages of compartment syndrome. Ashley recognized the signs, the tense, swelling muscle compartments, the pain that was starting to spiral beyond what morphine could touch. She knew what needed to happen: an emergency fasciotomy, a surgical opening of the compartment to release pressure before tissue death became permanent damage. She knew Whitfield was in the building. And she knew what he had promised about surveillance, about documentation, about consequences for anyone who stepped outside their role. The attending surgeon, a capable woman named Dr. Reeves, who had been at Cedar Creek for 7 years and who was not, fortunately for her, threatened by nurses who could think, ordered the fasciotomy. Whitfield was nowhere near the operating room. Ashley scrubbed in. She stood across from Dr. Reeves at the surgical table and watched the surgical resident, a young man named Patterson, prepare the incision. Patterson's hands were shaking. Just slightly. Just enough that Ashley saw it immediately. "Pressure," he said, and his voice carried a tremor that suggested he was 17 years old instead of 27. Dr. Reeves didn't notice. She was concentrating on the compartment anatomy, on the fascial plane that needed to open without violating the structures beneath. Ashley noticed everything. She noticed the slight hesitation, the way Patterson's fingers were not quite as steady as they should be, the way the scalpel was angled 1 degree off from optimal entry. She said nothing. She simply moved 1 step closer, and when Patterson's hand wavered, her hand was there, not guiding, not touching, simply present in the space where steadiness was required. Patterson felt it. He adjusted his angle. His hand became rock. The incision was perfect. Dr. Reeves glanced up and back down, continuing her work. She had not seen anything. Patterson felt the weight of Ashley's presence beside him and understood, in the way that experienced surgical professionals understand, that he had just received a masterclass in how a specific type of competence looks when it is not advertised. After surgery, alone in the scrub room, she removed her gloves with the same methodical precision with which she had conducted her entire shift. Her composure had not cracked. Not once. Not even in the moments when Whitfield had stood in the hallway making his threats, not even in the supply closet when her forehead was against cold metal and the unfairness of it pressed down on her like a physical weight. And that's when the phone buzzed in her locker. It was a text from an unknown number, Shepherd 6. Status report needed. Tomorrow. 0600 hours. Meet at the marina parking lot. Come alone. The call sign. The military designation that only 3 people in the continental United States were supposed to know. The name they had given her in Fallujah when she had led 14 soldiers out of a burning building using nothing but compass navigation and the kind of instinct that came from having done this before the world knew it needed doing. She sat on the bench in the locker room, still in scrubs, and stared at the phone. Someone had found her. Someone from outside. Someone who knew exactly who she was beneath the invisible nurse with the steady hands and the professional mask. The text crackles came through at 14:38 hours, right when the afternoon shift hit its stride. The collision had been massive, a tanker truck jackknifed across 3 lanes of I-405, triggering a cascade of impacts that swallowed 7 vehicles whole. The dispatch radio screamed the details: multiple ejections, fuel leak, secondary explosion hazard, extrication times estimated at 40 minutes minimum. Cedar Creek Medical was 15 minutes out from the main impact zone. That meant they were about to get buried. The automatic doors to the trauma bay slammed open at 14:52. The first ambulance shrieked backward into Bay 4, and the chaos that followed had the texture of a controlled explosion. 2 paramedics wheeled out a man with a pneumothorax, his breathing labored and shallow. Another rig pulled around the corner with a woman who'd taken blunt force trauma across her entire left side. Then came the 3rd ambulance. Then the 4th. Then the 5th before the first patient had even finished his initial assessment. Ashley moved through the controlled disorder like she was dancing a choreography only she could hear. 2 months of invisibility at Cedar Creek had taught her exactly where every piece of equipment lived, exactly which nurses responded fastest to orders, exactly how to slip into the background of the existing hierarchy without drawing attention. She was restocking the crash cart on Bay 7 when Dr. Whitfield came thundering down the corridor, barking orders and gesturing with the authority of someone who believed the hospital should pause while he thought. His white coat moved like a cape. His voice carried the particular timbre of a man who'd learned that volume could substitute for competence. "Start running type O negative for the burn patient in 3, he commanded. Then to another resident, "Get me CT on standby. Move fast or these people die." Nobody corrected him. Nobody mentioned that CT was already running a scan from the previous hour. Nobody said what Ashley already knew from the triage tags: 3 of the incoming patients were going to code out in the next 10 minutes without immediate intervention. The 5th ambulance brought in a teenage girl. 16, maybe 17, still wearing her school uniform beneath the ripped and blood-stained fabric of her jacket. The paramedics moved with the tight precision of professionals who knew this one was bad. One of them barked as they wheeled her into Bay 2, cardiac tamponade, suspected. Blunt force trauma to the chest. Diminished heart sounds bilaterally. Muffled. JVD present. Systolic pressure tanking, 86/60 and dropping. Cardiac tamponade. Blood filling the space around the girl's heart, compressing the chambers, preventing them from filling with oxygen-rich blood. The medical term for a heart being slowly strangled by its own body. Without intervention, she had maybe 8 minutes before her pressure dropped too low for her brain to function. After that, 8 minutes more before complete cardiac arrest. Whitfield moved to Bay 2 immediately. Ashley heard his voice through the glass: "Get me an anesthesiologist. Prep for emergency open chest. We're going straight to the cath lab." Wrong. All of it wrong. An open chest would take time they didn't have. The cath lab was for floors down. The girl would arrest on the elevator. Ashley moved toward Bay 2 without any visible urgency. The key to remaining invisible was never running. Never panicking. Never doing anything that suggested you had information nobody else possessed. She walked past Whitfield as he was barking at a nurse to fetch supplies, and as she passed, something shifted in her chest. A recognition. A door opening to a part of herself she'd spent 8 months keeping in a locked basement. She entered the bay and closed the curtain behind her. The girl was pale, her lips taking on the blue-tinted quality of someone not getting enough oxygen. Her neck veins were distended, the classic triad of Beck, the 3 signs of tamponade, muffled heart sounds, elevated JVD, hypertension. All present. All screaming that they were running on borrowed seconds. "I need a 14-gauge needle," Ashley said. Her voice came out different. Lower. The kind of voice that didn't ask questions, the kind that gave orders and expected them followed. The trauma nurse, a woman named Sarah who'd worked with Ashley for months without learning her first name, hesitated. Dr. Whitfield said open chest. He said cath lab. "Not going to make it," Ashley said. "Get me the needle. I need an EKG monitor, alcohol prep, and a local anesthetic. Move." Something in the way she said it crossed Sarah's face like a wire. She moved. The girl's eyes found Ashley's. "What are you doing?" "Saving your life," Ashley said. It wasn't a reassurance. It was a statement of fact. "You're going to feel pressure and some discomfort. That's normal. That's good. That means I'm in the right place. Her hands moved. Muscle memory from a deployment to Fallujah 8 years ago, from field medicine training, from 3 tours where you learn to think in seconds instead of minutes. She palpated the landmarks, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Just below the third rib. The needle was already in her hand, moving on its own trajectory, guided by knowledge so deep it lived in her fingers rather than her brain. The needle went in. There was a hiss, the blessed hiss of air escaping, the compressed air pocket rushing out of the pericardial sac, the pressure releasing from around the girl's heart. The monitor jumped. The rhythm came back. The flatness in the girl's face began to resolve into something resembling breathing. Pressure climbing, Sarah breathed. 88/60. No. 92/64. 100 now. 103. Ashley didn't move. Her hand stayed steady on the needle as the girl's body found its rhythm again. The monitor beeped once. Twice. 3 times. Sinus rhythm. Perfect, steady, alive. Whitfield appeared at the curtain. His face had a quality of confusion that aged him 10 years in a single moment. What did you? Pericardiocentesis, Ashley said. Tamponade. She was 2 minutes from arrest. The silence that followed had weight. It pressed down on the room like gravity. Whitfield looked at the girl. At the monitor. At Ashley. At the needle positioned with the kind of precision that nobody learned from 8 months of watching YouTube videos and reading protocols. Step back from the patient, he said. But his voice had lost its edge. It sounded thin now. Uncertain. Ashley withdrew the needle with the same steady motion she'd inserted it. The air hissed out one more time, and the girl's pressure remained stable. 105/70. Nearly normal. Nearly alive. Prep her for transport, Ashley said to Sarah. 2 units whole blood standing by. Monitor for reaccumulation every 15 minutes. If that pressure drops below 85, page me immediately. Then she turned to walk out of the bay. You, Whitfield said. The word came out like a gunshot. That was unauthorized. Ashley paused at the curtain. She didn't turn around. The girl was coding. You exceeded your scope. You performed an invasive procedure. That's a level 4 protocol violation. I'm writing you up. Ashley turned to face him. In her eyes, for just a moment, a fraction of a second that only Sarah saw, something shifted. The invisible nurse disappeared. In her place was something else. Something that had learned to kill in the dark and had somehow, against all evidence, learned instead to save. The mask didn't drop. But it flickered. She was dying, Ashley said. Simple. Factual. The kind of statement that left no room for negotiation. Whitfield's face flushed. And I am her attending physician. I make the decisions here. You follow protocols. You do not exceed your scope of practice because you think you know better. Ashley didn't answer. She walked out of the bay, moving back into the controlled chaos of the trauma center, back into the background where she'd learned to hide, and behind her she heard Whitfield on his phone, already making the calls that would begin the process of destroying her. The girl lived. That was the only part that mattered. But that wasn't the worst part. What they didn't know was that 3 of the other patients from the collision would die in the next hour, and Whitfield would be so preoccupied with documenting Ashley's protocol violation that he would miss the warning signs in the burn patient's blood work. And that choice, the choice to focus his attention on punishment instead of patients, would haunt him in the weeks to come, though not for the reasons anyone might expect. The cardiac monitor showed sinus rhythm, steady and strong, and the teenage girl's oxygen saturation climbed from the dangerous 68 where it had been 10 minutes earlier, 88 now, pushing toward 92. Ashley's hands were already moving toward the supply cart when Dr. Whitfield appeared in the doorway of Trauma Bay 2, his face the color of old porcelain. He watched her work. Watched her check the girl's pupils. Watched her document vitals with the precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times in conditions infinitely worse than a Portland emergency department. The silence in the room crystallized into something sharp and dangerous. "You performed a pericardiocentesis," Whitfield said. "Not a question." His voice carried the tone of a man observing a crime scene. Ashley continued documenting without looking up. Patient was in cardiac tamponade. ETA on cardiothoracic was 12 minutes. She had 4. Without authorization. Without a pulse, she didn't need authorization. He stepped closer, his shoe squeaking against the linoleum floor like an animal in pain. The attending physician who'd been frozen during the crisis suddenly found his voice, starting to explain, but Whitfield raised one hand and the man stopped mid-sentence. That was the moment Ashley understood. Not in her mind, she'd known since he walked through the door, but in some deeper register where she kept her classified mission details locked away. Whitfield wasn't here to thank her. He was here to begin documentation. He was building a case. That evening, while Ashley was updating the girl's file in the nurse's station, Whitfield's voice came through her phone with the particular cadence of someone calling from a moving vehicle. She recognized the background, the gentle thrum of an engine, the distant wash of water against a boat hull. The hospital board president's yacht. Whitfield had called during dinner. "I need to report a serious breach of protocol," Whitfield said, his words measured like drops of poison into clear water. "One of our nursing staff performed an invasive surgical procedure without physician authorization or approval from hospital credentialing. We're looking at massive liability exposure, potential loss of accreditation. This needs immediate investigation." The board president's voice, even through the phone line, took on the tone of someone already calculating legal fees. By midnight, Whitfield had contacted 3 separate departments. By 6 a.m., he'd reached out to Ashley's previous employment references, the ones listed on her resume, the ones that pointed to a 5-year stint at a medical clinic in San Diego. The people who answered those phone lines worked for naval intelligence. They stonewalled. They said nothing. They confirmed nothing. And that silence, Whitfield would later tell people, was the most suspicious thing of all. Why would a former employer refuse to verify basic employment history? What was there to hide? The more they didn't tell him, the more convinced he became that Ashley was hiding something catastrophic. By afternoon of the next day, Whitfield had retained Dr. Kenneth Rothschild, an outside medical review consultant who specialized in nursing protocol violations. Rothschild owed Whitfield a significant favor. 3 years earlier, Whitfield had helped bury a malpractice case where Rothschild had missed a medication interaction that left a patient permanently disabled. The case had cost the hospital $2.1 million, and Whitfield had convinced the board to classify it as a systems failure rather than individual negligence. Rothschild's reputation was intact. His career was intact. His freedom was intact. Now Whitfield was calling in that debt. Rothschild reviewed the pericardiocentesis procedure in less than 90 minutes. He determined it was outside the scope of nursing practice. He determined it was unauthorized. He determined it was, in his professional opinion, dangerous overreach by an insufficiently credentialed staff member. He didn't mention that the procedure had saved the girl's life. He didn't mention that without it, the girl would have been dead within minutes. He mentioned only the violation. At 8:17 a.m. on the 3rd day after the multi-vehicle collision, Ashley's badge was deactivated. Her locker was cleared by 2 hospital security officers while she stood in the break room, watching them remove her possessions: a small mirror, a photo of Kai at his high school graduation, a sweater she kept for overnight shifts. One of the officers, a man named Torres with the bearing of someone who'd served, wouldn't meet her eyes. He knew what he was doing. He didn't like it, but he was doing it anyway. HR told her the termination was effective immediately. Gross violation of scope of practice, the document said. Unauthorized performance of invasive procedure. There was more: pages of review notes, Rothschild's assessment, documentation of Whitfield's concerns. There was no mention of the teenage girl's cardiac status improving. There was no mention of the alternative being her death. There was no mention of Ashley's clear knowledge of exactly what she was doing and why. "You're free to appeal," the HR manager said, a woman named Patricia who'd been present during Ashley's interview 8 months ago. "There's a process for that." Ashley couldn't explain why she couldn't appeal. Couldn't explain that the moment her name went before a formal hospital board review, Naval Intelligence would have to pull her from her cover position. The patient she was supposed to be monitoring, the supply chain theft investigation, the equipment being funneled to third-party buyers, the whole classified operation, would collapse. The Navy would pull her, move her, reassign her to something legitimate and ordinary. Her real mission here would be dead. That evening, she was alone in the hospital laundry room on the basement level, the one that nobody used after 6 p.m. The industrial dryers hummed their monotonous rhythm, and the fluorescent lights above cast everything in the color of old bone. She held her scrubs, 3 sets, all of them wrinkled from the dryer, all of them still carrying the faint smell of antiseptic and the copper hint of work. She folded them one final time. The fabric was warm against her hands, and with each fold, she thought about something different. The first set, 8 months of showing up early, staying late, answering call lights. The second set, the night the trauma patient came in, the moment Ron Castellano had grabbed her wrist and whispered a name she hadn't heard in 7 years. The third set, the girl in cardiac tamponade, the clean needle entry, the immediate hiss of air escaping the pericardial sac, the way the girl's chest rose with actual breath instead of the terrible paradoxical movement of tamponade. All of it folded into neat rectangles. She sat on the edge of a laundry cart, the scrubs in her lap, and her hands began to shake. Not from fear. The trembling came from a different place entirely. It was the physical manifestation of rage compressed into absolute stillness, the way a vault holds pressure. Soldiers don't break. Soldiers don't cry. But they do feel, and what Ashley felt in that moment was the particular ache of months of work, of invisible sacrifice, of being good at something nobody would ever know about, collapsing under the weight of one man's vanity. She pulled out the object she'd kept hidden for 8 months, the combat boots. The one she'd worn in Fallujah during her first deployment, the ones with her call sign stitched into the insole by a medic unit who understood that some people needed to know they carried their names with them everywhere. The leather was scarred and creased, the sole worn through on the left heel. She held them in both hands and for a moment, just a moment, she thought about walking out of this hospital forever. Walking out of Portland. Walking out of the cover identity of Ashley Cooper, RN. Walking out of the life she'd built carefully and methodically, one 12-hour shift at a time. But then she felt it. The weight of the stitched letters inside the boot. Not her real rank. Not her official designation. Just the name that the people she'd bled with, the people she'd held while they died, the people who knew her, they called her when everything else fell apart. And she held the boots tighter and breathed in the smell of the laundry room around her, the chemical burn of detergent, the warm exhalation of the dryers, the faint copper of old blood that never quite washed out of hospital cloth, and she made herself a promise that this was not the ending. The rain started at 11 p.m., the kind of Portland rain that fell in sheets and turned the world into a watercolor painting. She sat alone in her car in the hospital parking garage, 3rd level, the one where the security cameras had a blind spot because the nurses had all learned years ago to use it for their 15-minute breakdowns. The windshield fogged with the warmth of her breath. In her lap lay the folded scrubs and the combat boots. On the passenger seat lay her hospital badge, deactivated and useless as a stone. Her phone had no messages. Her voicemail was full with nobody asking her anything. She'd spent 23 years in the military. She'd built a reputation in the special operations community that opened doors. People knew her name. People trusted her. And she'd walked away from all of it to fold scrubs in a hospital basement and monitor supply chain theft for an agency that wouldn't acknowledge her existence if she died tomorrow. The rain hammered against the car roof like applause from a crowd that wasn't there. She'd won firefights. She'd earned medals. She'd been through selections that broke people's bones and spirits simultaneously. But this particular kind of defeat, the kind that came from invisible institutional pressure, from someone with less competence and more politics destroying months of work, this was something she'd never learned to metabolize. She reached for the combat boots, held them in one hand, opened the car door with the other. The rain was cold against her face. All she had to do was throw them into the storm. Watch them disappear into the dark parking garage. Delete the digital record of Ashley Cooper from her phone. Call her handler and ask for extraction. The rain soaked through her jacket. It ran down her neck in cold rivulets. It carried the taste of diesel fuel from the shuttle buses and ozone from the lightning that flickered somewhere over the East Hills. And then, a sound. Not the rain. Not the wind. Something else. Something mechanical and distant, growing closer. The particular thrum of rotors that any military person recognizes in their sleep, in their dreams, in the moment before combat. A helicopter. Then another. Then a third. She held the boots in both hands and heard the rotor wash shake the parking garage. And then she heard, through her phone, through the emergency broadcast system, through the hospital intercom crackling to life, a voice she recognized. A voice from the team medical officer at Naval Intelligence, the man who'd placed her at Cedar Creek 8 months ago. One sentence, Shepherd 6, we're coming in hot. The boots didn't go into the rain. She held them against her chest and waited. The parking lot lights cast everything in amber. Ashley stood with the boot still pressed against her chest when Kai appeared between the cars, breath coming hard, carrying something wrapped in dark canvas. Mom. His voice cracked. 16 years old and he'd already learned how to deliver devastating news with a single syllable. They need to see these. I don't care about your reasons anymore. She opened her mouth. Closed it. The shadow box in his hands was oak with a glass face, the kind officers kept on office walls. The kind that belonged to another life entirely. Kai, put that back. No. He was already moving toward the hospital entrance, the box held like a flag. No more invisible. Not this time. She should have stopped him. Should have moved faster, pulled him back, reminded him of operational security and cover protocols and the fact that 16-year-old sons weren't cleared for classified information. Instead, she watched him disappear through the sliding doors and felt something in her chest crack open like a decompression chamber. The administrative wing smelled like fresh carpet and money. Dr. Marcus Whitfield stood in front of 3 television cameras, mid-sentence, his confidence the kind that came from never having lost a single institutional battle. Maintaining the highest clinical standards requires discipline. Protocol exists for a reason. We cannot allow individual healthcare providers to decide when rules apply. Kai pushed through the crowd of hospital staff. Doctors looked up. Nurses stepped aside for the boy like he was carrying something that mattered. Dr. Whitfield. Everything stopped. Kai opened the shadow box. Even from the corridor, even from 30 feet away, Ashley could see the medals catching the fluorescent light. Bronze Star. Silver Star. Navy Cross. Purple Heart. Purple Heart. Presidential Unit Citation. 8 years of operations reduced to ribbons and metal, and beside each medal, a small brass plate engraved with dates and unit designations. Ron Castellano was standing near the back of the crowd. He'd been discharged 2 weeks ago, walking on his own, breathing on his own, because of the needle Ashley had placed between his ribs when his lung collapsed. Now he worked as the VA liaison, conducting rounds at Cedar Creek Medical once a month. He saw the shadow box first. His eyes widened. His hand came up to his chest like someone had just called his name in a firefight. Shepherd 6, he said. Not loud. Just those 2 words, crystalline in the silence. That's Shepherd 6 from Fallujah. The hospital security chief stood by the door. Marcus Webb, former Marine gunnery sergeant, 23 years in uniform before he took the job at Cedar Creek because his knees gave out during a 10-mile hike. He saw the medals. He saw Castellano's expression. He saw the call sign engraved on the Presidential Unit Citation ribbon. Webb went pale. His posture shifted from civilian slouch to something his bones remembered. His left hand came up, fingers rigid against his thigh. Not a salute. Something older. Something that meant respect. "Master Chief Petty Officer on deck," he said. The room didn't just go quiet. The quiet had weight. It had mass. It pressed down like deep water. A general was touring the facility that morning. Brigadier General Sarah Chen from Naval Special Warfare Command, reviewing the hospital's new Veteran Services wing. She stood 3 feet from the shadow box, her dress uniform sharp enough to cut glass. She took the box from Kai's trembling hands. Her voice was steady as a surgeon's scalpel. "Navy Cross." She paused. Breathed. "For actions under fire, Jolin District, demonstrating extraordinary heroism and compassion while treating casualties despite ongoing enemy engagement." She looked at the next ribbon. Silver Star. Another pause that felt like forever. And another Silver Star. She turned to Ashley. "Presidential Unit citation for you and your entire team. You saved 847 lives during that deployment. Not missions. Not objectives. Lives." The patient Ashley had been monitoring, the one she wasn't supposed to know was selling military medical supplies on the black market, was standing in the corridor. He'd come for his discharge papers. He saw the shadow box. He saw the general's uniform. He understood, in that moment, exactly how badly he'd miscalculated which people he could do business with. He started crying. Not the performative kind. The deep, breathless kind that comes from years of holding something and finally being allowed to put it down. "She never used it," he said. The words fell out of him like water from a broken dam. She had the rank. She could have shut it down. She could have ordered him. She could have made him stop. And she never used it. Never once pulled the Master Chief card. Just kept working. Kept protecting us. 10 seconds. That was all it took. 10 seconds of silence so complete you could hear the ventilator humming in a nearby patient room, the refrigerator in the break room compressor cycling on, the fluorescent lights above vibrating at exactly 60 Hertz. Then Dr. Marcus Whitfield's coffee cup hit the floor. It was ceramic. It shattered across the tile in a way that sounded like breaking teeth. The coffee spread in a dark stain across the polished floor, and Whitfield stood frozen, watching it spread, his face draining of all color like someone had pulled a plug in his chest. General Chen's eyes turned to him. Just turned. That was all. A simple shift of attention from one human being to another. "You were saying," she said. Whitfield's mouth opened. Closed. His hand came up, a half gesture that meant nothing and everything. He tried to speak. Sound came out wrong, fractured, like something breaking in his throat. By that afternoon, the FBI arrived with evidence in a folder marked Cedar Creek Medical, personnel file tampering. They walked past the staff room in boots that echoed like a judgment. Agents showed badges. Simple credentials that meant everything. They had emails. Whitfield had tried to forge Ashley's personnel records. Had attempted to doctor her nursing license verification. Had even drafted fraudulent statements from her previous employers to justify her termination. Criminal forgery. Fraud. Obstruction of justice. Attempts to cover up what he'd done. When they put the cuffs on him, he made a sound like a wounded animal. They walked him past the entire nursing staff, the nurses he'd called incompetent, the nurse practitioners he'd belittled, the phlebotomists and technicians and respiratory therapists who'd watched him consolidate power through cruelty. Nobody said anything. They just watched. That was worse than words. 6 months later, Ashley Cooper stood in the afternoon light of her new office. Not a small closet. An actual office with her name on the door, Master Chief Petty Officer Ashley Cooper, Director of Veteran Care Coordination. She'd been reinstated. More than reinstated. Promoted. The hospital board issued a formal apology, established a new 24-bed Veteran Services wing, and committed $2.1 million annually to pro bono care for disabled veterans. She walked past a strip mall on her way to Cedar Creek Medical for a morning shift. A folding table sat outside a discount insurance office. Behind it, a man in a rumpled polo shirt with a name tag that read Steve tried to make eye contact with customers passing by. His eyes were the same, but everything else had changed. His posture had collapsed. His hands shook when he held the brochures. There was a tremor in his voice that came from somewhere deeper than nerve damage. Dr. Marcus Whitfield. Now just Steve. Selling health insurance at a folding table for $12.50 an hour. Ashley nodded once as she passed. Not cruel. Not kind. Just acknowledgement. Recognition that the universe had its own sense of proportion. Under her arm, she carried the pair of worn combat boots. The one she'd kept hidden in a basement closet for 8 months. The ones with sand still in the bootlaces from Fallujah. The one she'd finally allowed herself to place on the shelf in her office, visible to anyone who entered, proof that the quietest person in the room had been holding it all together the entire time. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The kind that comes from knowing exactly what you can do and choosing, every single day, to do something smaller. Something quieter. Something that serves instead of dominates. Kai was waiting in the break room, sitting on the edge of the counter like he'd been there all morning. He was smiling. Welcome back, Mom. She reached out. Pulled him close. And for the first time since leaving Fallujah, she let someone see the person beneath the nurse. Her fight wasn't in classified operations or shadow deployments anymore. It was here. In the corridors of Cedar Creek Medical. In the eyes of veterans learning to trust again. In the patient who came back 3 weeks after discharge, clean and steady and grateful. Here. Where she belonged. Have you ever met someone and realized you judged them completely wrong? Share your story below. Subscribe for more stories about the quiet heroes among us.